Chapter 8. Still grieving over the loss of Helena, Helen and the family were preparing food for the repast. Pete gave Helen money provided by Mr. Luigi to cover the funeral expenses. The money not only covered all expenses, but there was enough left over to start a life anew if she wanted to. The day after Marco was laid to rest, Mr. Luigi, Sophie, Donatelli, and a few close friends of Marco's attended Helena's funeral. The singing from the choir was enough to bring tears to your eyes and chills throughout your entire body. The reverend who officiated the funeral could have won an Oscar with the performance he gave while preaching from the pulpit. From the pews were sounds of grief and heartfelt sobs by those who knew and loved Helena. And when the pallbearers placed Helena's beautiful white casket upon their shoulders, the entire church hummed in unison like a song. It was a beautiful funeral indeed. The repast was at Pearly Days, and everyone who knew Helena and her family was there. Pete brought Helen to talk to Mr. Luigi. When Mr. Luigi saw Helen, he froze. He'd forgotten exactly how much Helen and Helena looked alike. He gave her a hug and said, "My sincerest condolences to you and your family." Helen looked him in his eyes and said, "And to you and your family as well." Then a few of Marco's friends hugged Helen and discreetly handed her an envelope filled with cash. "This is what Marco would have wanted us to do. You have our sympathy, Helen," they said. Helen was overwhelmed and went to stand at the back of the diner's door to catch her breath and take a break from everyone. Mr. Luigi motioned for Pete to meet him outside in the back of Pearly Days. "It was really nice, the way you treated Helen. I know how thankful she is to you, sir," Pete said. Mr. Luigi was looking at Helen standing in the doorway. "She looks just like Helena," he said. "Why, yes, sir, she do. They are twins, sir. You forgot?" "Yes, I guess I did." "That's to be understood with all you've been through, sir," Pete said. "I guess you're right, but seeing her reminds me so much of Helena, and thinking of Helena reminds me of Marco. It's like seeing a ghost," Mr. Luigi said. Then he turned and faced Pete. "I never want to see her again. I never want to see her face again, Pete. I can't take it. Understand?" The harsh look in Mr. Luigi's eyes said it all. "Yes, sir, Mr. Luigi. I understand," Pete replied. After the repast, Helen and Pete was upstairs with Teddy and Leela. "That fat dog, he's just as bad as his sister," Leela said. "What we gonna do?" Teddy asked. "The only thing we can. We gotta leave Chicago," Pete said. "Leave Chicago? I'm not going back down south, Pete," Helen protested. "Me neither," Teddy agreed. "We don't have to move down south. We can go to my hometown," Pete replied. "You told me you was born here," Helen said. "I said I was born in this state. I'm from East St. Louis, Illinois," Pete replied. Later that night, they told the rest of the family about Mr. Luigi's remarks and that they were moving to East St. Louis. "How far is that from here?" Miss Pearl asked. "About a day's ride if we start out at the crack of dawn," Pete replied. "And when do y'all plan on leaving?" Miss Lucy asked. "Well, we got to leave real soon. There are some things I have to take care of, and we have to pack up everything. I say we should leave in the next 3 days," Pete replied. "That soon?" Miss Lucy asked. "Yes, and the sooner the better. The man done gave them fair warning. They'll be fools to fiddle-faddle around," Miss Pearl answered. After Pete, Helen, Teddy, and Leela left, Miss Peaches looked at the rest of the family and asked, "Y'all game?" A few days later, when it was time to leave, Helen was regretting having to say goodbye to her family. She remembered the day Miss Peaches caught Teddy trying to steal food to feed them, and how Helena sassed Miss Peaches. Tears rolled down her cheeks when she thought about the first time stepping foot inside Pearly Days and how fast Helena took to Miss Pearl. She smiled while thinking of how grand the game house was to her and her sissy, and how they stopped traffic whenever they walked down the street together. The twins with the gams, she said to herself with a slight chuckle. That's what we called y'all, Pete said. Helen jumped. Pete, I was just thinking about old times. It wasn't so long ago, and you still got gams, he said. Helen smiled. Well, I guess it's time to go and kiss everyone goodbye, she said. Yep, it's time, baby. Teddy, Leela, and the baby are all packed with their wagon full and ready to follow, he said. I hate to have to wake them up so early, she said. They're used to getting up this early. Besides, I think they're already up. When Pete and Helen walked outside, there stood the entire Pearly Days family with wagons waiting to go. I know you ain't think we was going to let you leave without us, did you, gal? Miss Pearl asked. Helen ran and hugged Miss Pearl. Miss Pearl hugged her tightly and whispered in her ear, we're family, and family sticks together. After Helen hugged and kissed the rest of her family, Pete said, all right, enough of this mushy stuff, let's go. And they all mounted up and headed for East St. Louis, Illinois. When they first rode into East St. Louis, Helen could feel a shift in energy in the air. She assumed that since they would still be in Illinois, it would be almost the same. Of course, she didn't expect it to be as grand as Chicago, but she did assume the same rules would apply. What she later found out was not only were the rules different, but in its own way, East St. Louis was just as grand and even more intriguing. For starters, Pete owned a couple of pieces of land in his hometown, and his auntie took care of the properties on the land. He owned 4 houses, 2 houses on each piece of land. Pete's aunt used to throw card games at the houses and sold fish dinners on Fridays until some of the gangsters started running a game house. They asked Pete's auntie to run the card games for them, but her health had been failing and she turned them down. When Pete heard about her illness, he came to see her. He bought his auntie and cousins a 3-bedroom house and gave her enough money to live comfortably without her having to work. He told her all about Helen and her family and how he was going to marry her and move back home. After Helena and Marco's death, Pete contacted his family and asked them to make sure the houses were suitable to move in, and they did just that. Pete, Helen, Teddy, and Leela moved into 2 houses on one land, while Miss Pearl, Miss Peaches, Mr. Stage, George, and Miss Lucy moved into the 2 houses on the other piece of land down the road. Pete hooked up with some old gangster buddies of his, and they offered him a job at their game house. When Pete told them the Pearly Day folk was with him, they did not hesitate to hire them as well. Their cooking was known throughout the state of Illinois. Soon after Miss Pearl and Miss Peaches started cooking at the game house, Miss Lucy and Helen started running the card tables. It wasn't long before the family started their own diner. They called it Pearly Days 2. Teddy started working with Pete, while George and Mr. Stage ran the daily numbers. Soon after, everyone had adapted to the new city. Helen really liked East St. Louis. It was a small town with big city energy. The women were very pretty. They kept their hair salon ready and was always dressed to the nines. The men had a swag about them that she had never seen. They all wore suits and brims or derby hats on a regular basis. The people were very hospitable and greeted one another in passing. After small talk, they would say, "Have a blessed day," whether they knew you or not, and they celebrated every holiday and were the best cooks. Even Miss Pearl had to admit she had never tasted better fried jackfish and spaghetti. It was a vibe unmatched, and for the first time since she was a child on the Bridges plantation, Helen felt like she was home. The bosses at the game house liked the way Helen handled the catty women at the card games and asked would she consider running their whorehouse on 74th West Main in a small little suburb called Belleville. She politely declined and said it was because she already had enough on her plate. Truth is, Helen was flattered to have been offered the job, but her first priority was Pete and give him what he wanted most, a wife and some babies. 3 months after they settled in, Pete and Helen were married at St. Matthew's Baptist Church. Pete asked Helen where did she want to go for the honeymoon, and she answered, to Chicago to tell my sissy. So Pete made arrangements for them to go back to Chicago for a weekend without drawing attention, and Helen paid a visit to her sister's grave. Hey, sissy, I just had to come and show you my wedding ring. It's a thick gold band with a diamond rock, just like we said we wanted when we used to talk about our dream weddings when we was kids, remember? Then Helen kneeled down in front of the tombstone and placed flowers on the burial site. Last time I was here, I told you me and Pete was moving to his hometown. To my surprise, everyone from Pearly Days moved with us. We're still all together, still a family. You know I wouldn't have moved if it was too far away from you, but it's in the same state, so I guess that's fine. I miss you so much. It feels like only half of me is living and the other half died with you. But I know you are up there in heaven giving Mama and God a laugh time after time. Then Pete walked up and said, it's time to go, baby, and helped Helen get on her feet. Helen, never taking her eyes off her sister's grave, smiled and said, I don't know when will be the next time I will come to visit, but I made an ancestors altar just like the one Mama had, and I'll talk to you there. I love you, sissy. Then she turned to Pete and said, let's go. Marriage felt good to Helen. She woke up every day glad to be alive and well, and she fell asleep with a content heart and a peaceful mind. She knew that it was not just the marriage, but who she was married to. Pete was a wonderful husband, a good provider, and her best friend. Helen couldn't picture her life being any better and sometimes wondered what she did to deserve such happiness. That year, winter came with wind, sleet, and rain, and temperatures way below zero. Influenza was running rapid in the city. Some people were too sick to work, and most of the children were too sick to attend school. But no matter how cold it was, there was folks who somehow always made it to the game house. You would think they closed this place down for a spell, seeing how ill everyone is, Miss Lucy said. Now you know that ain't happening. As long as folks can buy coochie and gamble, these places will stay open, Helen replied. They both laughed. But Helen was right. Men still came to mix with the few girls who were not sick with influenza, and although the crowd grew smaller, there were still card games to run.